Stephen Parkin. BBC
Radio Somerset.
Now, when your life story takes you from serving in the army in British India and Shanghai to becoming an active communist, helping keep the streets of London free of fascists, to being a medical volunteer in the Spanish Civil War, surviving Dunkirk, and ending up making a difference at Musgrove Park Hospital, then you really should have a book written about you. Howard Andrews died at the age of 101 in 2008. He is described as a remarkable man, although remarkably modest, so thank goodness Dave Chapple decided to shine a light on this just incredible life. Dave met Howard when he was 98. They stayed close friends. Dave has now written a book about him and their friendship. Good afternoon, Dave.
Good afternoon.
What an interesting man he was. How did you come to meet Howard?
Simon, I'd written a book about another communist activist, somebody who was a very interesting person, Henry Suss. He was living in a home for the blind in Burnham-on-Sea, and a regional newspaper gave it, much to my surprise, a double-page spread as a review. And I had a phone call one afternoon, a very, very weak voice, weak but clear, and that was Andy, that was Howard Andrews, who said he would like a copy of the book, and he said to sign off that he was 98 years of age and he'd been in Spain. And to somebody, you know, who knows his left-wing history, the history of the fight against Franco, I knew what that meant. So within a couple of days, I was around at his bungalow in Middleway, and we started a friendship that lasted until he died.
And the book it's written the conversation that you have with him, and it's lovely because you go through his fascinating life. Obviously, we'll get on to the Spain bit in a minute, but his dad was in the forces, and that's possibly why he ended up there?
I think that's possible. Also, his elder brother, Norman, and by some sort of sleight of hand that was accepted by the army due to an oversight, at the age of 15, Andy signed up to the army, and to get an adult rate of pay, he actually signed up underage in his brother's name. And one of the funny things, Simon, is that for the next 30 years he was known in the army not as Keith Howard Andrews, but as Norman Andrews, even though his brother was still in the army. And when just before Dunkirk he joined up again because he was on reserve, he actually wrote saying he better own up to this because he didn't want to land up in jail. And the army sent him a letter refusing to change his name. So that was a funny thing.
And he basically borrowed his brother's birth certificate, which is how he kind of got it through. But he ended up in the Royal Army Medical Corps, and his first posting abroad was to India. I sort of couldn't quite tell if he liked it there.
I think he did, with one big reservation, Simon. So he was stationed most of the time in Baluchistan, part of British India. Pakistan and India weren't divided then, and there was a lot of sport. Most of the medical aid was either officers being injured riding their horses, including polo horses, or, to be honest, syphilis in Quetta and Lorelei, where he was stationed in Baluchistan. But the reservation was in Bombay, Mumbai, where he docked. They had half a day free, and he wandered around and he saw hundreds and hundreds of emaciated Indian women carrying 200 weight baskets of coaling a ship. And he was told by the foreman that how little they were paid, but also that some of them who were pregnant had their children, obviously with families to sort of look after the birth, around the back in the dark, and then carried on working, and that really set him thinking about the British Empire. So he was a loyal soldier in many ways, of course, but a bit of a rebel as well.
And that's really interesting, isn't it? Because he was, as we know, younger than he should have been to even be there, and to sort of have that empathy with the world when you're somewhere completely new, when you are literally thrown into a different country. He was posted to Shanghai, wasn't he? And there he kind of saw some pretty awful things too, didn't he?
I think when I talked to to Andy, as you know, he liked to be known about Shanghai. I was so ignorant about that amazing time in which Britain did play a part, because it was a time when Mao Zedong was building up his Red Army and about to go on the Long March. But before that, there was this terrible civil war between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong that reached the corners of Shanghai, and I was so ignorant about that. But I think Howard Andrews was probably the last surviving British Army veteran of that Chinese Civil War.
Which is just an incredible thing to sort of take with you. He when he came back to England, still in the forces, that's when he joined the Communist Party, and that's when he kind of found his voice, a public voice, didn't he?
Well, he was on reserve. I'm not an army expert, but a very skilled army private, Royal Army Medical Corps. They kept him on reserve, liable to be called up at any moment. But back to Kilburn, where he was brought up, and he was unemployed, just couldn't find a job. And the Communist Party organised thousands of unemployed men and women in something called the National Unemployed Workers Movement. I mean, you didn't have to be a communist to join. You had to be unemployed. But Howard was active. He remembers standing on a stool in his street and giving his first ever public speech. And of course, there were a few cars to run you down then. And he said he had an audience of about 50. And I said, so you were 22 or whatever, 23, and you spoke in your street about the plight of the unemployed, and how long did you speak for? And he said, about 20 minutes. This is just a remarkable time and a remarkable life, which fascinated me, which is so different from today. The idea of public speaking and an audience for it. Yeah. So the unemployed action, and then the fight against Oswald Mosley's fascists, which is quite common knowledge, but was still an amazing time.
And, I mean, we're barely scratching the surface of the life that was still within him, and he's done so much and achieved so much. How did he end up in Spain during the Civil War?
He was working as a porter in a London hospital. Said he hated it. He was a stoker. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up with his Musgrove Park Hospital career much later. He was a stoker in a London hospital, and you can imagine that with the coal-fired furnaces of a hospital. And, Andy was somebody who was, 5'0", 5'4", and very, very slim. So that would have been a pretty grim job. And, he was a communist. But not the least interesting thing, Simon, about his volunteering to join in, I won't say the fight, of course, because Soldier Saving Lives is the title of the book, and he was a medic in Spain as he was in the army. But he joined Spain. He was one of the first British volunteers to get to Spain to take part in the Republican government's struggle against Franco's revolt. And so although he was a Communist Party member in Kilburn, he joined before the Communist Party started the International Brigades, which also means that, the casualty rate of the British volunteers, who were largely Communist Party members, but also others, was horrendous. But Andy survived his time in Spain, not without being attacked many, many times in field hospitals for about 19, 20 months. So he lasted longer than most.
And you did go back to Spain with him, didn't you, when he was 99?
Well, that was, that was a time which, still brings back heavy emotions for me, because he was the oldest volunteer to go, the oldest veteran. He was 99. Num Nuenta Nueve, which I kept on saying to the Spanish, and there were 30-odd survivors from all over the world. And that was a very emotional occasion, because it was the last homage to the people who helped to fight the Spanish government against Franco. And that was in October 2006. And when we were landing in Bristol Airport on the way back, this 99-year-old said, Dave, he said, that was the best week of my life.
Oh, that's amazing. Did you get a sense when you were there with him of how he viewed the Spain of the current time as it was then, and how he was viewed?
He'd he'd obviously welcomed the demise of Franco back in 1976. I think he had been to Spain once or twice with his wife Ada, but to be honest, it was also much kind of celebrations and people, paying tribute to these volunteers that I didn't really. I'd already interviewed him about his time in Spain, but he just had a wonderful time and met some of the other surviving international brigaders, including Jack Jones, the famous British trade unionist who, before he led the Transport and General Workers Union, had been a volunteer in Spain, and Jack Jones was there.
Interesting that as he nears the end of his life, although obviously we didn't know that then, but even when he was 100, he was still a man on a mission, and he even tried to recruit the Queen.
Well, Andy was enjoying a much-deserved and pretty obscure retirement. He retired at 65 from being a porter at Musgrove Park Hospital, where he'd been an active trade unionist and a merit holder for his union, but much enjoying his retirement until the past came calling, and then from 98 right through to 101. Just a month before he died, he was very, very active politically against nuclear weapons, against Trident. He rejoined the current version of the Communist Party, and when a gentleman in Andy said, dressed Andy said in a very smart suit, came calling to inquire if it was okay to expect a Queen's telegram on his 100th birthday, Andy had already written to the Queen protesting and asking her to cancel Trident nuclear missiles, and he politely declined the Queen's telegram, very, very politely. So another act of rebellion, but this time a very polite one. And his comment to me was, Dave, he said, his comment to this gentleman was, my friend, he said, me and the royal family have been friends for decades.
Quite right.
All very polite. All very polite.
And the last thing we've got to cover is, and again, any of these individual bits would have been enough for an interesting story about an interesting man. Here he is, and he's storming Glastonbury, bizarrely, the festival.
Well, it was an appalling day, Simon. It was pouring down with rain. And Nigel Costley of the South West TUC was wondering whether to cancel it, because Glastonbury for quite a long time has had this left field. Michael Eavis was always sympathetic to CND and causes like that. That's how Glastonbury started. And so you got this left field tent where maybe 400 or 500 people of a left-wing inclination hear speeches and music and stuff. And we got Andy invited, but he only made it there because he was carried, wheelchair and all, through ankle-deep mud by 5 or 6 severely left-wing Hells Angels who got him on there. And I was really nervous because, it's one thing interviewing somebody who's 100, 101. It's one thing maybe doing a little radio interview, but speaking to an audience of 500 when he hadn't spoken in public for maybe 50 years, 60 years, 70 years even, because he was never a leader in the trade union movement as such. He was always rank and file. And Simon, he was just brilliant. He was just brilliant. He spoke about his time in the Royal Albert Hall in October 1936 when he was first of all beaten up by Mosley's strong-arm gang because Andy had dared to infiltrate a fascist rally in the Royal Albert Hall, and then was also assaulted by the police when he'd been thrown down the stairs. So he'd had a hard time, and he recounted that, but he linked it with the rise of racism and the far right, it went down an absolute storm. I was so proud of him because he didn't have a single note. A remarkable man.
Well, I can tell from the way you've been talking about him that he obviously had a massive impression on you. And the book, well, there's so much more in the book, and we've covered so much, and yet there's so much more. Thank you so much for your time. How do we get hold of the book?
Best thing for anybody listening who's interested, Simon, is an email address. I've just thought about this. So if people have got a pen or have got a reasonably good memory, it's David Chapple, one word, and that's Chapple, David Chapple one word, 2020 at gmail.com. And the book's £5, £2 postage, and it's a lovely production thanks to Nigel Costley of the South West TUC, so it will be enjoyed by anybody interested. Thanks.
Well, I mean, the words are great, and there's also some lovely pictures there of stuff as well as of the man himself. But thank you so much for your time this afternoon. The book is called Soldier Saving Lives. Keith Howard Andrews, Kilburn, Aldershot, Quetta, Shanghai, Spain, Dunkirk, Taunton. It's honestly, it's 15 lives in one book. It is 131. It's BBC Radio Somerset. As Dave said, you know, if you are interested in getting the book, Dave Chapple, CHAPPLE 2020 at gmail.com is where I'll be able to send you more information.